Coming up, under successive Conservative governments ever since 2010, there's been a massive decline in the living standards of the average family in the United Kingdom. The party's policies of austerity and privatisation have left a significant proportion of the population struggling to make ends meet, with 4.3 million children now living below the poverty line. Meanwhile, after 350 public swimming pools having closed or reduced their opening hours since the beginning of last year's energy crisis in order to hit reduced spending budgets, Rishi Sunak is spaffing tens of thousands of pounds, upgrading his local electricity network so it can accommodate the Rolls Royce heating system for the private swimming pool at his manor house in Yorkshire.
This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
What a wonderful metaphor for a Tory-governed country that is increasingly divided between the haves and the have-nots. The Tories have created a legacy of a broken Britain that will take years to repair. I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your social media contacts. In this video, I'm going to take a look at what I consider the top 5 major reasons why the Tory mindset has broken Britain over the last 13 years. So let's get stuck in right away with the first. One of the most significant failures of this and every other Conservative government has been their lack of investment in public services. The Tories proudly proclaim that they are the party of small government, the idea being that small government equals low taxation, libertarian economic policies and unregulated capitalism, free of the burdens of pesky environmental and consumer standards. The logical consequences of such a mindset are demonstrated in the water industry, where environmental deregulation has weakened environmental protections. According to the Times newspaper, this resulted in sewage being discharged in coastal areas for 1 million hours in 2022, including 8,500 hours of sewage discharges from overflows close to England's blue flag beaches, which are meant to have the highest water quality of all. I remember the outcry when the Tories first privatised the water industry. At the time, it seemed obscene that such an essential public service such as water and sewage could be used as the source of profits for Tory donors and cronies. But of course, these companies prioritise profit over environmental protection. Over the last 34 years, private operators have cut corners, reduced spending on necessary upgrades, and prioritised cost savings, which has got us to where we are now, with inadequate sewage treatment practices and increased pollution in our rivers and coastal waters. And of course, it's not just water. A similar pattern can be seen in the energy sector, for example, and the rail network, the buses, and the postal service. In every one of the privatised industries, we see service levels degraded for end users, and a redistribution of money from salaries to dividends at the expense of workers and to the benefit of shareholders and the bosses. The rich are getting richer in Tory Britain and the poor are getting poorer. We now have a record number of billionaires in the UK, 177, with a combined wealth of £653 billion. Rishi Sunak and his wife don't come into this top 177, but they're not that far off, with their joint fortune of £730 million, putting them at number 222. The Conservative Party have always covertly governed on behalf of the oligarchs, but as George Monbiot has pointed out recently, we now actually have our first oligarch Prime Minister, and that Rishi Sunak is the oligarch's oligarch, ever responsive to the demands of big capital and the 3 offshore plutocrats who own the country's biggest newspapers, oblivious of the needs of the 67 million people who live here.
I have friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class.
The oligarchs don't care about the great unwashed, and they hate seeing the state funding public services that give no opportunity for profit for the oligarch class. This is the philosophy behind the austerity measures implemented by the government ever since 2010, which have led to cuts in funding for the National Health Service, the criminal justice system, education and social care. This has resulted in longer waiting times for medical treatment, backlog in the courts, overcrowded classrooms, and a shortage of care workers. The NHS has been particularly hard hit, with many hospitals struggling to cope with demand, and patients facing long waits for vital procedures. The government's neglect of public services has had a profound impact on many people's lives, leaving them struggling to access the care and support that they need. In this short video, I don't have the time to detail the complete wrong-headedness of austerity, but austerity was a political choice, not a necessity, and has led to the situation now where debt has theoretically doubled under the Tories to a grand total in excess of £2 trillion. And I say theoretically because this talk of a national debt is completely based on creative accounting and is only used to convince a gullible public that austerity is necessary to avoid piling on the costs of the nation of servicing the debt. There is no magic money tree, they say, unless they're picking off the fruits of PPE, that is, to hand millions of pounds of contracts to their cronies and donors. We can't go on like this, they say. I'm a big fan of Richard Murphy, Professor of Accounting at Sheffield University, who points out in his wonderful e-book Money for Nothing that the national debt in the UK actually started back in 1694 and has increased almost without interruption ever since. So it would seem that 329 years of history says we can keep going on like this. Richard Murphy also points out that there very obviously is a magic money tree. What we now know after quantitative easing is that the Bank of England can create money on demand. Japan, for example, has created more than 200% of its GDP in quantitative easing and is still doing pretty nicely despite that. So what the limit is in the case of the UK is not yet known, but it's likely we have a very long way to go. The housing crisis is another issue that has worsened under these Conservative governments. Homelessness has increased significantly, and many, particularly younger people, are struggling to afford to rent or buy a home. The government's policies have made it easier for property developers to make a profit at the expense of ordinary people. They have failed to build enough affordable housing, and their policies have led to the privatisation of social housing. Add that to the list of privatisations. This has left many people living in substandard accommodation or forced to rely on expensive and insecure private rentals. The charity Crisis are reporting that we're on course to have 300,000 households suffering homelessness in the UK this year. That's an increase of 74% since Cameron became Conservative Prime Minister back in 2010. 1 in 58 Londoners are homeless, and that's according to the Evening Standard. And the BBC reports that rough sleeping has increased by a quarter over the last year alone. Meanwhile, our very own Prime Minister owns a total of 4 homes worth a combined $18.3 million. Another indicator of just how broken post-Brexit Britain really is. Because let's not forget that Brexit has been a contributor to Britain's demise from the moment of the Leave vote back in 2016, which spooked overseas investors into looking elsewhere for a home for their economic activities. Forget the ridiculousness of the actual idea of Brexit, isolating an average-sized nation from an increasingly connected world, applying trade sanctions to itself and cutting itself off from free access to its biggest export market, sitting on its geographical doorstep. That's just the theory. No need to mention the loss of rights and freedoms for its own citizens to live, love and work in 27 other countries. And not to mention losing the security of being a part of the world's largest economic bloc. No, the actual implementation of this bonkers idea has also been well and truly bollocksed by this incompetent, dogmatic and corrupt government. May, Johnson, Truss and Sunak have all promised to deliver Brexit quickly and efficiently, but they failed to do so. The negotiations are still fraught with difficulties, and the uncertainty surrounding the UK's future relationship with the EU has caused significant economic damage to the tune of a 4% hit to the British economy, according to the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility. And that figure rises to 5.5% when compared to a theoretical doppelganger UK economy that stayed within the EU. And that's according to the Centre for European Reform. And all this government can respond with is to say, look over there, we've now joined the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. This bloc is made up of 11 countries, 9 of which we already have free trade agreements with, including the much ridiculed trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand that have rung the death knell for British farming.
British farmers have reacted with shock to the terms of a new free trade deal with New Zealand.
The deal will see Kiwi meat imported without tariffs, and farmers in the UK say they get nothing in return.
A world away from rejoicing Kiwi farmers, their welly-wearing counterparts feel as though they are the sacrificial lambs of the free trade deal.
We're not competing on a level playing field.
The UK's less intensive approach to farming means their offerings could quickly be outpriced and outstocked by New Zealand's once tariffs are removed.
The CPTPP deal is said to be worth £15 billion over 10 years, which equates to a 0.08% growth in the British economy. To put that another way, Brexit meant losing £5.50, and the CPTPP replaced just 8 pence of that loss. So another 69 trade deals the size of the one with the CPTPP, and we've managed to replace the trade advantages we lost through Brexit. But not our place at the decision-making table of one of the world's 3 main superpowers, nor our freedom of movement, nor the benefits of participation in European Union schemes such as Erasmus, the European Medicines Agency, or the Horizon Scientific Programme. The Tory approach to Brexit has been characterised by a lack of transparency and accountability, with many decisions taken behind closed doors and steering a path to one of the hardest of hard Brexits that both Leave and Remain voters were promised would never happen. Leaving the single market was never on the table, they said. Project Fear. Leaving the customs union was never on the table either, they said. Project Fear. Leaving Erasmus and other cooperative agreements with the EU need never happen, they said. Project Fear. But every one of those things came to pass. This has led to a breakdown in trust between the government and the public. And we can see this reflected in the polls, where the Tories have been trailing the Labour Party by around 20 percentage points for many months now. Brexit was a major factor in producing the broken Britain that we can see all around us. We're still waiting for a single, measurable and definable benefit of Brexit after 7 years. Is there one thing about Britain that is better now in 2023 than it was in 2016? Well, I can't think of anything. And of course, the pandemic is often used as a convenient excuse by successive Tory prime ministers. But even there, the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been criticised by health professionals and international commentators for being slow and inadequate. The UK had one of the highest per capita death tolls in the world from COVID. And the government's handling of the crisis was and still is confusing and inconsistent. The lack of support for small businesses and self-employed people, myself included, left many of us struggling to make ends meet. While at the same time, they were spaffing billions and billions on Dido Harding's not-fit-for-purpose test and trace programme and dodgy PPE supplied through secretive red carpet contracts with Tory donors, cronies and even family members. Oh, and their local pub landlords too. In 13 years, the Tories have also completely failed to tackle the climate crisis. Despite setting targets for reducing carbon emissions, they failed to take the necessary action to achieve them. All words and no action. All promises and no money. They've continued to support fossil fuel industries through subsidies and have failed to invest in renewable energy sources. There's been a war against solar farms for some reason, and also a war against onshore wind farms, while at the same time the government is ploughing millions into the nation's first new coal mine in 30 years and into opening up new oil fields in the North Sea. The lack of investment and leadership in the green energy space has left the UK lagging behind other countries in the race to reduce carbon emissions and combat climate change. World-beating. You're having a laugh. If you look at America, China and the EU, with the best will in the world, at this stage, as an ordinary, isolated, medium-sized nation, we just cannot compete and have been left in the starting blocks while these larger players have completed the first lap. With the amazing technical knowledge in our universities, the resources of the so-called Silicon Fens linking Oxford and Cambridge universities, a decade ago we were well placed to be a global leader in the renewable energy sector. But the Tory aversion to investment and their aversion to state support, spending or involvement in the industry has seen our technical lead squandered and ensured that we will forever be a net importer of green energy technology. So, look, these are just a few of the factors that have broken Britain. But a primary characteristic of any failing state is corruption. Well, it was Tory sleaze and corruption that sank the previous Tory government of John Major. And although you might think it reached its height under Boris Johnson, with Owen Paterson, PPE contracts, test and trace, buxom blondes from America giving IT lessons, and many other scandals, it's necessary to identify that there is a long-standing pattern and history to this Tory corruption. It's not isolated incidents or individual stories that give the full picture. This is systemic. Sure, the most egregious examples of corruption during this government occurred during the coronavirus pandemic, where profit was considered more important than people's lives. The expensive and not fit-for-purpose solutions sourced from their private sector chums without scrutiny or a proper tendering process, while at the same time circumventing the NHS, local public health teams and Public Health England, no doubt contributed to the UK's world-beating death rates. But it wasn't just during COVID. There's also been more than a few peerages given out in exchange for donations, knighthoods too, and property deals done allowing Tory donors like Richard Desmond to avoid tax, with Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick facing accusations of cash for favours. There's also been the disgraceful pork barrel politics of millions of pounds in the state's Towns Fund, earmarked for impoverished communities, but which were actually disproportionately handed out to Tory-leaning marginal constituencies.
Integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Detailing all the corruption swirling around the Tory government since 2010 would be the basis for a whole YouTube channel, not just one section of a short video like this. But even this very week, we've seen the latest symptoms of this systemic Tory corruption following publication of the Times investigation into Scott Benton, Tory MP for Blackpool South, who also happens to be the chair of the Betting and Gaming all-party parliamentary group. He lost the Tory whip late on Wednesday after journalists posed as investors wanting behind-the-scenes information on the gambling sector. The scumbag Benton said he could leak a copy of the upcoming Gambling Harms White Paper at least 48 hours before it went public. The Register of MP staff shows Benton also sponsors a pass for Steve Donoghue, who declares his other employment as being a gambling and consultant. His website says he charges £18,000 to advise on securing a gambling licence. This latest story of endemic and institutional Tory sleaze will unravel further over the coming days, I'm sure. But in conclusion, the whole legacy of the Conservative government since 2010 has been one of a broken Britain. Austerity, privatisation, and a lack of investment in public services have left many people struggling to access the care and support they need. The housing crisis has led to a rise in homelessness and a shortage of affordable housing. The government's approach to Brexit has been characterised by dogmatic, aggressive and stubborn anti-European rhetoric and a lack of transparency and accountability. And their failure to tackle the climate crisis has left the UK lagging behind other similar countries. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the government's weaknesses in terms of preparedness and responsiveness after many years of cuts and austerity. It's now time for a general election to give voters the chance to give their verdict on 13 years of decline, neglect and destruction. Only by voting the Tories out can we hope to repair the damage and build a fairer, more equal society with a focus on mending relations with our friends and neighbours in the European Union.